Here's your introduction. The sun was just beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the quiet suburban street. A mother, exhausted from a long day, was walking toward her car with her groceries in hand. Her little boy, no older than 6, skipped beside her, humming a song he had learned in school. It was supposed to be just another evening, another routine trip home. But in an instant, everything changed. A police cruiser rolled up beside them, tires screeching as it came to a sudden stop. The officer inside, a man with sharp features and a hardened glare, stepped out, his hand hovering near his holster. His expression was cold, his stance rigid. "Ma'am, what are you doing in this neighborhood?" he demanded. The mother froze, gripping her son's hand tighter. Confusion flickered across her face. "I live here," she said, her voice calm but firm. She gestured toward a house just a few yards away. But the officer wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind. "Step away from the vehicle," he barked. Her heart pounded. She could see the suspicion in his eyes, the unspoken accusation. She knew exactly what was happening. She had seen it too many times before. "I don't understand," she said carefully. "Is there a problem?" The officer's patience snapped. He grabbed her wrist, yanking her back. Her son let out a frightened yelp, clinging to her leg as she stumbled. "Mommy," the boy cried, his small hands shaking. "Sir, please, you're making a mistake," she pleaded, trying to steady herself. The officer tightened his grip. "I don't need to explain myself to you," he sneered. "I know your type." Tears welled up in her eyes, not from pain, but from the humiliation, the fear. She knew better than to resist, but she also knew she couldn't just let this happen. People had started to gather, murmuring among themselves, some recording with their phones. The tension in the air was thick. And then, just as suddenly as it began, a car door slammed nearby. A voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the chaos. "Officer Matthews, what the hell are you doing?" The officer stiffened, his grip loosening just enough for the mother to pull free. He turned, and his face went pale. Standing there, eyes burning with fury, was his superior, his commanding officer. But what sent a chill down his spine wasn't just the rage in the man's voice. It was the realization of who the woman was. His boss's wife. The street fell silent. Officer Matthews' breath caught in his throat as his commanding officer stormed toward him, his eyes locked on the scene in front of him. The mother stood frozen, one arm wrapped around her trembling son, her other hand still red from the officer's grip. The neighbors watched in uneasy anticipation, their cameras still rolling. "Let her go." The words came slow and sharp, each one slicing through the air like a blade. Officer Matthews hesitated for only a second before he finally took a step back. His heart pounded as realization crashed over him. His boss, the man who had the power to end his career with a single word, was staring at him with pure, unfiltered rage. "Sir, I was just..." Matthews stammered, but the words wouldn't come out right. The commanding officer's jaw was tight, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He turned to the woman, his expression instantly shifting from fury to concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, but her face was still pale. She bent down, gently rubbing her son's back as he sniffled against her shoulder. "We're fine," she said, though her voice was strained. The officer exhaled, looking back at Matthews with an intensity that made his stomach twist. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" His voice was low, but it carried a weight that made Matthews' chest tighten. Matthews' mind raced. He had assumed she was just another suspect, another person who didn't belong. But now, standing here under his superior's piercing gaze, he realized how badly he had messed up. His hands were still shaking, but he wasn't sure if it was from fear or anger at himself or at the situation. The murmurs from the growing crowd grew louder. Some whispered among themselves, others muttered words Matthews couldn't make out, but he didn't need to hear them to know what they were saying. The mother, now standing tall again, looked Matthews directly in the eyes. There was no anger in her expression, just exhaustion, disappointment. "You didn't even ask for my name," she said quietly. "You just assumed." Those words stung more than any reprimand his boss could have given. The commanding officer took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the bystanders. He knew this wasn't going away, not with witnesses, not with cameras. "We'll be handling this," he said firmly, giving a glance to another officer who had just arrived. Matthews swallowed hard. He had spent years enforcing the law, but tonight he had crossed the line. And now he wasn't sure if there was any way to fix it. The weight of the moment pressed down on Officer Matthews as he stood frozen in place. His commanding officer, his boss, hadn't looked away, his expression unreadable now. The street, once just another quiet neighborhood, had transformed into something else entirely. The murmurs of the crowd, the soft cries of the boy, the flashing of phone cameras, it was all becoming too much. The mother's eyes remained on him, steady and piercing. She wasn't yelling, wasn't demanding anything. She didn't have to. The truth of what had just happened was written all over the scene, and no amount of excuses could erase it. Then the radio on Matthew's belt crackled. A voice from dispatch called in another routine update, oblivious to the chaos unfolding here. He reached for it instinctively, but his boss held up a hand. "Don't," he said. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. The mother let out a slow breath, still holding her son close. Her heart was still racing, but she refused to let it show. She had learned long ago that fear wouldn't protect her, that staying calm was the only way to get through situations like this. But now, looking at her husband who had walked out of their home just hours earlier, thinking it was just another ordinary day, she saw the barely contained fury in his eyes. "Let's go inside," he said to her gently, his voice shifting from the hard, authoritative tone he had used on Matthews. He placed a hand on her back, guiding her toward the house. The boy wiped his face against his mother's shoulder, but he was still watching everything, still feeling the weight of something he was too young to fully understand. Matthews watched as they walked away, the realization of what he had done settling in deeper with every step. He had attacked his boss's wife. He had terrified an innocent child. And the worst part, he had done it without a second thought. The other officers on the scene shifted uncomfortably. One of them, Officer Reyes, finally stepped forward. "Matthews," he muttered under his breath, "what were you thinking?" Matthews didn't have an answer. He wanted to say he had been doing his job, but that felt like a lie now. Had he even stopped to consider anything beyond his own assumptions? The crowd still lingered, waiting to see what would happen next. Phones were still recording. The internet would know about this soon enough. His boss turned back to him, his face like stone. "I'll be seeing you in my office first thing in the morning," he said coldly. Matthews swallowed hard. He knew this was far from over. The night felt heavier than before. Officer Matthews stood stiffly, his mind racing, his pulse still hammering in his ears. The quiet murmurs of the onlookers had started to fade, but their lingering stares burned into his skin. He had been in difficult situations before, but nothing like this. Nothing that made him feel so exposed, so undeniably in the wrong. As the mother disappeared into the house with her son and husband, his boss, Matthews finally let out a shaky breath. His hands still tingled, his body still wired with adrenaline, but the reality of what had just happened was hitting him harder by the second. Reyes shifted beside him. "You don't come back from something like this," he muttered. Matthews shot him a glare, but there was no bite behind it. He knew Reyes was right. He had seen officers lose everything over less. And this wasn't just any situation. This was personal. His boss had just watched him grab his wife in front of an entire neighborhood. He had humiliated himself, humiliated the department, and no amount of backpedaling could erase that. The front door of the house slammed shut. Inside, the mother placed her son down on the couch, brushing a hand over his curls as she whispered to him, assuring him everything was okay, even though it wasn't. Her husband paced the room, his fists clenched at his sides. "I could have lost you," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned, exhaustion lining her face. "I know." He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "He put his hands on you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "On you and I had no idea." His mind was spinning. He had worked with Matthews for years. He had trusted him, had thought of him as nothing more than a dedicated officer. But now he couldn't stop replaying the scene over and over in his head. The way his wife had looked so small under Matthew's grip, the fear in their son's eyes. The mother swallowed hard, trying to push down the emotions threatening to rise. "This isn't new," she admitted softly. "This happens all the time. To women like me, to families like ours." Her husband stopped pacing. He turned to her, really looking at her, and for the first time, it hit him just how deep this went. He had spent years enforcing the law, believing in the people he worked with, but now that belief was unraveling right in front of him. Outside, Matthews stood near his cruiser, staring at his reflection in the window. His own face looked different now, harder, more uncertain. His boss's words echoed in his mind. "I'll be seeing you in my office first thing in the morning." Matthews knew his life was about to change forever. But what he didn't know was just how bad things were about to get. Matthews barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the mother's face, her quiet disappointment, the way she had held her son protectively. He saw his boss's eyes too, filled with a rage he had never witnessed before. He kept thinking about how quickly everything had spiraled, how a moment of blind assumption had thrown his entire career into jeopardy. His phone had been buzzing with messages from fellow officers, some checking in, others warning him that the department was already in damage control mode. The video was spreading. People were talking. By the time morning arrived, Matthews felt like a man walking toward his own execution. He stepped into the station, his uniform crisp, but his nerves frayed. Officers whispered as he passed, some shaking their heads, others avoiding his gaze altogether. The weight of their stares followed him all the way to his boss's office. The door was already open. His boss sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room was suffocating. "Sit down," his boss said flatly. Matthews obeyed, swallowing hard. He had expected anger, shouting, maybe even an immediate suspension. But what came next knocked the air out of his lungs. "There's an investigation," his boss said. "Internal affairs is involved." Matthews blinked. Sir, I know I messed up, but is that really necessary?" His boss's eyes darkened. "You think this is just about last night?" He leaned forward, his voice lower now, but far more dangerous. "Do you have any idea how many complaints have been filed against you?" Matthew's stomach twisted. What? Citizens, people of color, parents, even fellow officers, his boss continued. "I didn't want to believe it. I defended you. But now I can't ignore the pattern." A cold sweat broke out on the back of Matthew's neck. "Sir, His boss cut him off. "And that's not even the worst part." Matthews sat still, his pulse hammering. His boss slid a file across the desk. "Do you remember an incident from 2 years ago? A traffic stop that turned violent? A suspect who was injured in custody?" Matthews hesitated. There had been so many stops, so many arrests, but something about the way his boss was looking at him made his blood run cold. His boss exhaled sharply. "That man, he was my wife's cousin." The words hit Matthews like a punch to the gut. "You're telling me that twice now, you've put your hands on people connected to my family," his boss continued, his voice dangerously low. "And I have to ask myself, is it a coincidence?" A silence stretched. The walls of Matthew's world were closing in fast. And for the first time, he realized there might not be a way out. Matthews felt the walls closing in. His boss's stare was unrelenting, his words like a slow, crushing weight. The room suddenly felt too small, too hot. He had walked in expecting a reprimand, maybe a suspension, but this, a full investigation. Past cases being dragged back up, and now the revelation that he had unknowingly hurt not just one, but *2 people connected to his boss's family. I didn't know, Matthews stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. His boss leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. That's the problem, isn't it? He said, his voice eerily calm. You never stop to think. You never stop to see people before making a decision. Matthews felt his pulse hammering in his ears. He had always thought of himself as a tough officer, someone who handled situations without hesitation. But sitting here now, under the weight of his boss's gaze, he felt something he had never truly experienced before: powerlessness. A sharp knock on the door made both men turn. An internal affairs officer stepped in, holding a folder thick with documents. It's worse than we thought, the man said, his expression grim. He set the folder down, flipping it open to reveal a list of complaints, reports, and eyewitness accounts. Matthew's mouth went dry. He recognized some of the names. People he had pulled over, people he had confronted, people who had tried to push back but never got anywhere until now. The IA officer continued, given the evidence, the department is left with no choice. Matthews, you're being placed on unpaid leave, effective immediately. Your actions last night, and your past record, are under formal review. Depending on the outcome, you may face criminal charges. Matthew's heart dropped. This wasn't just about a bad night. This was his entire career slipping through his fingers. His reputation, his badge, everything he had worked for, gone. His boss nodded toward the door. Hand over your gun and your badge. Now. For the first time in his life, Matthews hesitated. He had never pictured himself in this position, never thought the power he wielded could be stripped away so easily. Slowly, with shaky hands, he unhooked his badge and set it on the desk. Then he reached for his holster, unfastening his gun and sliding it forward. As he stood up, his boss looked him dead in the eye. You're lucky, he said. If it weren't for who you did this to, you might have walked away with just a slap on the wrist. But this time, you finally have to answer for it. Matthews clenched his jaw, shame burning through him. He turned and walked toward the door, every step heavier than the last. But just as he reached for the handle, his boss spoke again. Oh, and Matthews. He paused, gripping the doorframe. You should probably know, his boss said, his voice colder than ever. My wife just hired a lawyer, and she's pressing charges. Matthew's entire body went numb. This wasn't over, not even close. Matthews stood frozen in the doorway, his boss's words ringing in his ears. His mind scrambled for some way out, some explanation that could undo the damage, but there was nothing left to say. His fate had already been sealed. As he walked out of the office, the whispers from the other officers grew louder. He kept his head down, moving past them, but he could feel their stares. Some were surprised. Others, he could tell, weren't shocked at all. Maybe they had seen this coming long before he had. By the time he stepped out of the station, the reality of his situation settled in like a heavy weight on his chest. His career was gone. His reputation was shattered. And now a lawsuit. He had always believed he was untouchable, that his badge would always protect him. But now he finally understood. He wasn't the one in control anymore. Across town, his boss sat on the couch beside his wife. Their son had finally fallen asleep after a long night of tears and confusion. The weight of everything still lingered between them, but for the first time in hours, she let out a deep breath. Do you think he'll actually face consequences? She asked, her voice low. Her husband hesitated, his fingers running over the badge still clipped to his belt. I don't know, he admitted, but this time he won't walk away so easily. She nodded, staring out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. It wasn't just about Matthews anymore. It was about all the people who had been through the same thing, who never got justice, who never even got to tell their stories. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like something had finally changed. Some way down the street, Matthew sat in his car, gripping the wheel tightly, staring at his own reflection in the rearview mirror. He didn't recognize the man looking back at him. Because for the first time, he wasn't the one holding the power, and he had no idea what would happen next.